On a cold November morning in 2019, police received a 911 call that would unravel a family secret buried for years. A man was found dead in his home. The suspect, his sister. But what nobody knew at that moment was that this murder had been planned, meticulously, for over a decade. She smiled at family dinners. She helped him move apartments. She was his confidant. But all along she was counting down the days until he was gone. And the reason? It would shock everyone who knew them. What would make a sister want to murder her own brother? This is the story of Victoria Sutherland and her younger brother, Christopher. On the surface, they were like any other close-knit siblings. But beneath the surface lurked resentment, betrayal, and a plan so calculated that even seasoned detectives struggled to believe what they were uncovering. 3 questions haunted this case. Question 1. What secret was Christopher hiding that could destroy his sister's life? Question 2. When did Victoria decide her brother had to die? And question 3. Was this really a murder or something darker? Let's go back to the beginning. Victoria and Christopher grew up in suburban Colorado, in a middle-class family that looked picture-perfect from the outside. Their mother was a nurse. Their father was a businessman. They went to church. They volunteered. By all accounts, they were the kind of family that every neighborhood had. Normal, stable, and unremarkable. But Victoria, 7 years older than Christopher, always felt something her brother didn't understand. Even as children, Christopher was the golden child. He was charming, athletic, and naturally gifted. People gravitated toward him. Teachers smiled when he walked into classrooms. Coaches recruited him. Girls called the house asking for him. Victoria, on the other hand, was the responsible one, the quiet one, the one who took care of everyone else. While Christopher played football, Victoria helped her mother with the younger cousins. While Christopher went to parties, Victoria worked part-time jobs to help pay for family expenses. She was reliable, steady, and invisible in the way that responsible older siblings often are. For years, Victoria told herself this was fine. She was proud of Christopher. She was happy to support him. Family came first. That's what she believed. But that changed when Christopher turned 16. That's when Victoria discovered something about her brother that would alter the course of both their lives forever. Something he'd hidden from everyone, including their parents. Something that would, in many ways, set them on a collision course that neither of them could escape. Christopher Sutherland seemed to have it all. Good looks, charm, athletic talent, and a promising future. College scouts were already watching him. He was going to play football at a Division I school. He was going to be someone. That's what everyone said. But behind closed doors, Christopher had a secret. He had a gambling addiction. It started small. Poker games with friends in someone's basement. Betting on football games. Trips to the local racetrack with money he shouldn't have had. But it spiraled quickly into something much darker. By his early 20s, we're not talking about casual betting. We're talking about serious, compulsive gambling, credit card debt, loans from people you don't want to owe money to, late-night poker games that would stretch until 4 in the morning, games where Christopher would bet money he didn't have, couldn't get, and had no way of repaying. By his early 20s, Christopher owed nearly $400,000 to various bookmakers and loan sharks across Colorado. $400,000. That's a life-altering amount of money. That's the kind of debt that ruins people. That's the kind of debt that makes people do desperate things. And here's where the story takes a dark turn. Instead of coming clean to his family, instead of admitting he had a problem and asking for help, Christopher started borrowing money from Victoria. Small amounts at first, $1,000 here, $2,000 there. Victoria would ask where it was going, and Christopher would give her a story. He needed it for a car repair. He needed it for an apartment deposit. He needed it for a friend in trouble. Victoria wanted to believe him. She loved her brother, despite everything, despite all the ways he'd been the golden child while she worked quietly in the background. Victoria still loved him. So she gave him the money. Then it got bigger. $5,000, $10,000, $20,000. Christopher would call her late at night, his voice desperate and frightened. He'd tell her about the people who were threatening him. He'd tell her what they said they'd do if he didn't pay. And Victoria would do what she always did. She would give him the money. Because what else could she do? He was her brother. He was in danger. He needed her. By his late 20s, Christopher had borrowed more than $150,000 from Victoria. $150,000 that she had earned through years of work, sacrifice, and careful financial planning. Money that she'd been saving for a house, for a wedding, for a future that she was building for herself. But she gave it all to Christopher. Victoria had her own life. She had a good job. She was saving for a house. She was engaged to a man named Marcus, who supported her, who loved her, who understood her in ways that her family never had. Marcus was planning to marry her. They were going to buy a house together. They were going to build a life together. But every time Christopher called, every time he cried on the phone about being in trouble, Victoria gave him money. She took out loans in her own name to cover his debts. She cashed in her retirement fund. She maxed out credit cards. She was drowning financially, spiraling into debt just to keep her brother afloat. But she couldn't say no. She couldn't turn her back on him. He was her family. Until one night in 2017, everything changed. Victoria discovered that Christopher had done something that crossed a line she never thought he would cross. He had taken a $50,000 loan using her name without her permission. He had forged her signature on the documents. He had put her at legal risk, at financial risk, and at the risk of criminal prosecution. The loan was in her name. If Christopher didn't pay it back, it would be Victoria who faced the consequences. It would be Victoria's credit that was destroyed. It would be Victoria who could be sued. When Victoria confronted him, she expected him to apologize. She expected him to break down, to admit what he'd done, to beg for her forgiveness. She expected him to finally understand the impact his addiction was having on people who loved him. Instead, Christopher got angry. He told her that it was her fault. He said she was being selfish. He told her that if she just gave him the money willingly, none of this would have happened. He said she was being a bad sister, a bad family member, a bad person, for not understanding what he was going through. He blamed her for his crime against her. That night, Victoria called off her engagement. She told Marcus everything. She told him about the money, about the loans, about the forged documents, about all of it. Marcus listened, and then he did what a good man does. He told her he loved her, but he couldn't marry her under these circumstances. He couldn't be part of this cycle. He couldn't tie his future to someone who was financially entangled with someone else who was actively destroying that future. He left, and as Victoria sat alone in her apartment that night, surrounded by the financial wreckage of her brother's addiction, one thought crystallized in her mind. A thought she'd never allowed herself to have before. A thought that terrified her and, in some dark way, relieved her. Her brother had to go. She didn't mean it as a moment of anger. She didn't mean it as a fleeting thought that would pass by morning. She meant it. Deep down, in the part of her that had been pushed aside and ignored and sacrificed for her entire life, she meant it. Christopher Sutherland had to die. What came next wasn't impulsive rage. Victoria didn't grab a knife in a moment of anger. This wasn't a crime of passion, a moment where emotions overwhelmed judgment and led to tragedy. No. What came next was something far more deliberate, far more calculated, and far more terrifying in its cold rationality. This was a plan, and it would take 2 years to execute. Victoria spent months researching. She read books about poisons that she checked out from different libraries, so nobody would connect them to her. She looked into ricin specifically, which was difficult to trace and nearly impossible to detect in a toxicology screening. She purchased books on forensics online, using a VPN to hide her internet activity. She created anonymous email accounts. She learned about how poisons work, how the body processes them, what symptoms appear when, and how long it takes for death to occur. She went to gun ranges and took classes on handguns, though she'd never owned one in her life and had no intention of using one. She was studying different methods, different approaches, hedging her bets in case her primary plan didn't work. She kept detailed notes in a password-protected journal. She documented her thoughts, her grievances, the ways her brother had wronged her, the ways her life had been derailed by his addiction. She wrote about the money. She wrote about the stolen identity. She wrote about the engagement she'd lost. She wrote about the future she'd sacrificed. And then she wrote about the plan, step by step, detail by detail, as if she were writing the plot of a novel, mapping out the perfect crime. But here's what nobody expected. Here's the twist that would become clear only when the police finally found all of this evidence months later. Victoria didn't do it alone. In early 2018, Victoria met a man online through a true crime forum. His name was Nicholas Brennan. He was a software engineer, divorced, isolated, and carrying his own rage at the world. When Victoria carefully began sharing details of her situation, not the plan, just the emotional pain of it all, Nicholas listened. He listened like nobody else listened. He understood her. He validated her pain. He made her feel seen in a way that she hadn't felt seen in years. He was kind to her. He was gentle with her. He made her feel like her suffering mattered. And slowly, over the course of months, Victoria began to tell him more. Not the specific details of the plan, but the general outline. She told him she was thinking about hurting her brother. She told him she was considering making him disappear. She waited to see how he would react, testing to see if he would judge her or abandon her. Instead, Nicholas offered to help. Not just emotionally, not just as a confidant. He offered to actively participate in the crime. He helped her plan the logistics. He even offered to do it himself, to be the one to actually commit the murder. He was in love with her, or at least, he believed he was. Victoria had allowed him to fall in love with her. And now, that love, if you could call it that, made him willing to commit murder for her. Nicholas became her accomplice. The opportunity came in November 2019. Christopher was going through another crisis. His gambling debts were piling up again, and he was desperate. He called Victoria asking for help, asking for money, asking her to save him one more time. Victoria invited him over to her apartment. She told him she wanted to talk. She told him she wanted to help. Maybe she wanted to apologize for being distant. Maybe she wanted to give him one more chance. Maybe she wanted to make peace before what she had planned. Christopher had no idea that this invitation was a death sentence. He had no idea that his sister had spent 2 years planning his murder. He had no idea that his time was running out. He came to her apartment on a Friday evening in November. The weather was cold. The sun was setting early. Nobody would see him come in. Nobody would see him leave, because he wouldn't be leaving at all. Victoria greeted him at the door. She hugged him. They sat down. She offered him a drink. His favorite whiskey, mixed with cola, the way he liked it. The poison was in the whiskey. Victoria had mixed it carefully. A dose of ricin, dissolved in liquid, undetectable to the taste or smell. She had researched the exact amount needed to cause death without being obvious. She had calculated the timeline of how long it would take to work, based on the victim's body weight, metabolism, and overall health. She handed him the drink, and Christopher took it. He drank it without hesitation. Why would he be suspicious? It was his sister. It was his favorite drink. It was a quiet evening with family. There was no reason to suspect that anything was wrong. Victoria sat across from him and watched him drink the poison. She watched as, slowly over the next hour or so, Christopher began to feel sick. He mentioned that his stomach hurt. He said he felt dizzy. He told her he might be coming down with something. Victoria listened sympathetically. She offered him water. She told him to rest. Christopher lay down on her couch. And as he lay there, as his body began to shut down, as the ricin began to destroy his internal organs, and his consciousness began to fade, he looked at his sister. And in that moment, he understood what she had done. He asked her, "What did you do?" Victoria didn't answer. She didn't cry. She didn't express remorse or regret. She didn't call for an ambulance. She didn't try to save him. She just watched. Christopher Sutherland died 6 hours later on his sister's couch. The morning after, Victoria called 911. She told the paramedics that Christopher had come to her apartment and complained of chest pain. She told them that he had collapsed. She told them that she had performed CPR and tried to save him. She told them that she didn't know what happened. The paramedics found him dead in her apartment. The initial assumption was that he'd had a heart attack or a stroke. Christopher was only 32 years old, but his lifestyle, the stress, the drinking, the constant anxiety about his debts, made early death seem plausible. He was unhealthy. He didn't exercise. He drank heavily. He was under constant stress. The case seemed open and shut. Tragic, certainly. Unexpected, definitely. But not suspicious. The medical examiner performed an autopsy. He found no obvious signs of foul play. Christopher's heart was enlarged from years of stress and poor living, but that wasn't unusual. There were no marks on his body. There was no sign of struggle. The case was written off as a natural death. The file was closed, but then Detective Patricia Gomez decided to look at it again. Detective Gomez was meticulous. She was the kind of detective who didn't accept easy answers. She noticed something odd about Victoria's timeline. Victoria claimed that Christopher had collapsed around 7 p.m., but Victoria hadn't called 911 until 7:45 p.m. That was 45 minutes. If Victoria truly thought her brother was having a heart attack, if she truly thought he was in immediate danger, why would she wait 45 minutes to call for help? When questioned about this, Victoria said she had been in shock. She said she'd panicked. She said she didn't remember exactly when it happened. Detective Gomez made a note of it. Gomez also noticed Victoria's demeanor during their initial conversation. Most people who lose a family member suddenly are devastated. They cry, they're confused, they're in shock. Victoria was calm. She was composed. She answered questions clearly and directly. She didn't seem sad or surprised. She just seemed empty. Detective Gomez decided to request a full toxicology report. The toxicology report came back, and everything changed. The hospital lab found ricin in Christopher's bloodstream. Ricin is a poison derived from castor beans. It's not something that occurs naturally in the human body. It has to be deliberately introduced. Finding ricin in Christopher's system meant one thing: he had been poisoned. And poisoning is murder. Suddenly, a tragic accident became a murder investigation. When Detective Gomez and her team returned to question Victoria, they brought warrants. They brought police officers. They brought the authority of the state and the law. They searched Victoria's apartment. They searched her car. They requested access to her work computer and her personal devices. And they found everything. They found books on her shelves about forensics and poisons. They found printouts of articles about ricin hidden in a drawer. They found encrypted emails with Nicholas Brennan that discussed, in veiled language, what they were going to do and how they were going to do it. They found her password-protected journal, and they worked with a tech expert to crack it. And in that journal, they found the detailed plan. Every step, every timeline, every motive, every grievance. It was all there, written in Victoria's own handwriting. In her own words, Victoria had documented her own crime. In the interrogation room, Victoria initially denied everything. She stuck to her story. Christopher had a heart attack. She didn't know about any poison. It was an accident. She was innocent. But as Detective Gomez presented piece after piece of evidence, the research, the emails, the journal entries, the timeline, Victoria's story began to crack. Finally, she stopped lying. She didn't cry. She didn't beg for forgiveness. She didn't claim she was insane or out of her mind. Instead, she calmly explained her reasoning. She talked about the money she'd lost. She talked about the life she'd sacrificed. She talked about the ways her brother had stolen her identity and destroyed her credit and put her at risk of legal prosecution. And then she said something that chilled every detective in the room. He was never going to stop. I had to stop him. Victoria Sutherland had murdered her brother in cold blood, and she didn't regret it. As the investigation deepened, there was one more shock. Nicholas Brennan, the accomplice, came forward, but not to confess to his crimes. Instead, he came forward to betray Victoria. He told police that Victoria had manipulated him. He claimed that she had groomed him emotionally, had made him fall in love with her, and then had used him to help her commit murder. He painted himself as a victim of her manipulation. He claimed that he had been too in love with her to say no, too desperate for her approval to refuse her requests. He tried to escape responsibility by portraying himself as her victim. This raised a critical question for the investigators. Was Nicholas telling the truth, or was he simply trying to escape the consequences of his own choices? The more they investigated, the murkier the picture became. But one thing was clear. Victoria Sutherland had murdered her brother, and Nicholas Brennan had helped her do it. The trial of Victoria Sutherland became one of the most controversial cases in Colorado legal history. The prosecution presented their case first. They painted Victoria as a cold, calculated killer. They showed the jury her research. They showed them her emails. They showed them her journal. They built a timeline that proved premeditation. They presented expert witnesses who explained how ricin works, how it enters the body, and how it causes death. The prosecution wanted the jury to see Victoria as a monster, a woman so consumed with rage and greed that she had murdered her own brother for money and revenge. Then they called a surprise witness, Marcus, Victoria's ex-fiancé. Marcus testified that Victoria had asked him, months before the murder, hypothetical questions about how untraceable poisons worked. She'd asked him if he knew anything about ricin. She'd asked him about toxicology and how medical examiners determine cause of death. At the time, he had laughed it off. He'd thought she was just morbidly curious, interested in true crime the way a lot of people are. But in retrospect, as Marcus sat on the witness stand looking back at their conversations, he realized the truth. Victoria had been planning this all along. She had been gathering information. She had been testing whether he knew anything that could help her or hurt her. Every question had been part of her larger plan. The prosecution rested their case feeling confident. They had built an airtight case against Victoria Sutherland. They had proven premeditation, motive, and action. They had shown that she had cold-bloodedly murdered her brother. But then the defense presented their case. And the defense had a bombshell. They presented evidence that Christopher had been sexually abusive to Victoria when she was a teenager. In sealed medical records that hadn't been previously disclosed, a therapist documented conversations from 1998 in which Victoria, then 14 years old, described her brother's inappropriate behavior. The records detailed years of abuse, years of molestation, years of a young girl being victimized by her older brother. Christopher had been sexually abusing Victoria since she was a young teenager. Nobody had known about it. Victoria had never told her parents. She had never told anyone except this one therapist, and those records had been sealed and lost in the system. But the defense had found them, and now, the entire trial was reframed. Suddenly, it wasn't just about money. It wasn't just about Christopher's gambling addiction or the financial abuse he'd inflicted on his sister. It was about decades of trauma. It was about sexual abuse. It was about a young girl being violated by her own brother, and then spending her entire adult life enabling him, supporting him, sacrificing for him, all while carrying the weight of that abuse. The defense argued that Victoria hadn't murdered her brother in a moment of anger over money. Victoria had murdered her brother because on some deep, primal level, she was still that 14-year-old girl who had been abused by him, and she had finally reached the breaking point where she could no longer tolerate his existence. The defense argued that Victoria had been living under psychological tyranny for over 30 years. The jury deliberated for 5 days. When they returned, they had reached a compromise verdict. They found Victoria Sutherland guilty of second-degree murder. Not first-degree murder, which would have meant premeditated killing with malice aforethought. Not innocent, but second-degree. Guilty of killing her brother but with mitigating circumstances. Guilty because there was planning, because there was calculation, because there was intentional poisoning. But mitigated by decades of abuse, by trauma that nobody had ever addressed, by suffering that nobody had ever acknowledged. Victoria Sutherland was sentenced to 25 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. She showed no emotion as the verdict was read. She didn't cry. She didn't protest. She didn't claim that justice had been served or that she'd been wronged. She simply accepted it. But in the courtroom that day, people were asking themselves difficult questions. Had justice been served? Had a broken woman been punished for finally breaking? Had the legal system failed Victoria so completely that her only option was to take matters into her own hands? The case should have ended there. Victoria convicted, sentenced, incarcerated. Nicholas Brennan also convicted and sentenced to 15 years. Christopher dead and buried. The family broken and scattered. Justice, such as it was, served. But the story didn't end. In fact, the most shocking revelation was still to come. 3 years after Victoria's conviction, an investigative journalist named Claire Henderson was researching Victoria's case for a true crime podcast. Claire was digging into Christopher's background, trying to understand who he really was, trying to see past the narrative that the trial had presented, and she discovered something buried in old police records. In 1997, Christopher had been investigated for sexual assault. A college classmate had filed charges against him. She claimed that he had assaulted her at a party. The charges were dropped, but according to rumors that Claire heard, they were dropped because the woman's family was paid off. Christopher's father had money. He had made the problem go away. The accusation was real. Christopher had assaulted a woman in college, and he had escaped consequences because his father was wealthy enough to make it disappear. Claire decided to track down that woman. When she found her and interviewed her, the woman corroborated the story. She told Claire that Christopher had assaulted her. She described what had happened. She explained why she had accepted the settlement instead of pursuing the case. She had been traumatized. She had been young. She had wanted it to go away, and the money had made that possible. But she also told Claire that she wasn't alone. Over the next few months, Claire found 3 other women who had experienced sexual misconduct from Christopher Sutherland. One had been assaulted. One had been sexually harassed. One had been raped. Some had tried to press charges. Some had simply stayed silent, ashamed and traumatized, trying to move on with their lives. Christopher Sutherland had been a serial sexual predator, and his own sister had killed him. Suddenly, Victoria Sutherland's story transformed from a simple murder case into something far more complex and far more morally ambiguous. She wasn't just a sister protecting herself from financial exploitation. She was a survivor of sexual abuse, whose brother had gone on to hurt other women, and she had done something about it. Not through the legal system, which had failed to hold him accountable, but through violence. This revelation split the public into two camps. Some people saw Victoria as a vigilante. They saw her as a woman who had taken justice into her own hands because the legal system had failed her and would continue to fail others. They saw her as someone who, in her own way, had protected future victims from a predator. They believed that while her method was wrong, her motive was justified. Others still viewed Victoria as a murderer. They argued that taking the law into your own hands is never acceptable, regardless of your reasons. They argued that Victoria had murdered her brother before he had been held accountable for his crimes against other women. They argued that while Christopher was clearly a predator, Victoria's response, premeditated poisoning, was not justified by his actions. But everyone agreed on one thing. The story was far darker and far more complicated than anyone had initially understood. This wasn't a simple case of sibling rivalry or financial abuse leading to murder. This was a case of intergenerational trauma, sexual abuse, predatory behavior, and a complete failure of the legal system to hold anyone accountable. Claire Henderson's podcast became wildly popular. Millions of people listened to her investigation into Christopher Sutherland's past and Victoria's crimes. The case was reopened in the court of public opinion. In 2023, Victoria Sutherland filed for an appeal based on new evidence of the victim testimony. She argued that the trial court had been prejudicial in not allowing her to fully present evidence of Christopher's abuse of other women. She argued that this new evidence was material to her case and that she deserved a new trial. Her appeal is still pending. Today, Victoria Sutherland remains incarcerated. She serves her sentence in a women's prison in Colorado, where she works in the prison library and teaches other inmates to read. By all accounts, she has been a model prisoner. She has shown remorse, not for killing her brother, but for the methods she used, and for involving Nicholas Brennan. Nicholas Brennan was convicted as an accomplice and sentenced to 15 years. He serves his sentence in a men's prison in the same state. He and Victoria do not communicate, and Christopher's other victims continue to grapple with the knowledge that the man who hurt them is dead, not brought to justice through the legal system, not convicted, not sentenced, not held accountable in a courtroom, simply dead, silenced by his own sister's hand. So the question remains, and it's a question that each of us must answer for ourselves. Was Victoria Sutherland a murderer? Yes. She poisoned her brother. She planned it carefully. She executed the plan methodically. By any legal definition, she is guilty of murder. But was she also a victim? Yes. She was sexually abused as a teenager. She was financially exploited as an adult. She was failed by every system that was supposed to protect her. The legal system didn't hold her abuser accountable. Her family didn't protect her. Society didn't demand justice for her. Was Victoria wrong to take her brother's life? Almost certainly. Premeditated murder is wrong, regardless of the circumstances that led to it. But if the legal system had done its job, if Christopher had been prosecuted for sexually abusing his sister, if he had been convicted and imprisoned for assaulting other women, would he still be alive? That's the question that haunts this case. That's the question that keeps people up at night. What would you have done? If you had been abused by your brother, if he had continued to exploit you, if the legal system had failed you, if nobody was going to hold him accountable for his crimes, what would you have done? Would you have walked away? Would you have accepted that justice would never be served? Or would you have done what Victoria did? These are uncomfortable questions. They don't have easy answers, but they're the questions that this case forces us to confront. Because Victoria Sutherland didn't kill her brother in a moment of rage. She didn't strike him down in self-defense. She didn't act impulsively or irrationally. She made a choice, a deliberate, planned choice, and for that choice, she is paying the price. She is in prison. She has lost her freedom. She has lost her future. But is that justice? Or is it just another failure of a system that has failed her repeatedly? I don't have the answer. Nobody does. But this case reminds us of something important. That behind every crime, behind every tragedy, there are people. Complex, broken, suffering people. People who have been hurt and who have hurt others. People whose stories challenge our assumptions about right and wrong, about justice and revenge, about accountability and forgiveness. Victoria Sutherland murdered her brother. That is a fact. But Christopher Sutherland was also a sexual predator who escaped accountability. That is also a fact. Both things are true, and both things matter. So I leave you with this question. What do you think? Do you believe Victoria Sutherland deserves parole? Do you believe she was justified in what she did? Do you believe she's a victim who finally broke, or a murderer who took the law into her own hands? The answers you give to these questions say something about you. They say something about what you believe justice looks like. They say something about your understanding of accountability, of trauma, of forgiveness. This is the story of Victoria Sutherland and Christopher Sutherland. It's a story about family. It's a story about abuse. It's a story about the legal system failing people when they need it most. And it's a story that raises questions we all must answer.